So I'm just gonna, I can say so much about Susan. I just have learned so much. I first heard Susan, probably 10 years ago when she came to the RUIC.
Oh, yeah.
Or more, no more actually, because I've been in 10 years in Rockwood. I would say more like 15 years ago. So Dr. Johnson is a professor emeritus in OBGYN and epidemiology at the University of Iowa, where she has practiced. We have one more. She served several administrative positions as Associate Dean, Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs, and as the University Ombudsperson. She continues work in women's health research, is the chair of the NIH-funded multi-center longitudinal cohort study of menopause and the study of women's health across the nation. She has a long-standing interest in time management and productivity and has given about 700 talks on this topic. And her business, she has a small business called Thriving Amidst Chaos that provides workshops and individual coaching. And she has a website, which I will put into the chat in a second, that you can go to, where she has a lot of resources and articles around time management. So since several of you scholars talked about time management, and I know I don't care what stage of your career you are in, it's always a challenge. So I thought this would be wonderful. And so welcome, Susan. I'm looking forward. I learn every time I listen to you, I learn something new. So thank you so much for being here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So it's great to be here. In morning is where I am. So the reason that I got interested originally in time management was because of the troubles that I myself was having. And so I've built my own systems and practices around sort of wide reading in this genre of time management and organization, and trying a lot of things out and talking to a lot of people. So I'm hopeful today I can bring you some ideas about ways you might sort of improve your own processes, especially around finding time for project work, including research and writing. So that'll be the focus of what we're going to talk about today. My website is here. Mana's going to put it in the chat box. You'll get copies of these slides if you don't have them already. We'll make sure that you get those. The agenda for today is divided into two pieces, sort of an organizing part and then how to find time to actually do things. So we're going to talk about something called project work, planning for the week and the day, and then the time finding. So I think it's the case that success in most academic positions is dependent on your ability to not just plan and work on, but to execute high priority project work. Publications would be one example of that. It might be curriculum development if your focus is in education, but getting that project work done, which is over and above your kind of everyday job duties, is a key. And of course, that's the most difficult thing to do because it doesn't fall naturally into a scheduled day. So that's the kind of the theme for what we're going to talk about today. Let me start by giving you what will sound like kind of a obscure definition of project, but I'm going to give you enough examples that hopefully you'll have the idea by the end. So I'm going to define project as work that has a concrete outcome or deliverable that requires multiple tasks done over time to achieve. So it's not something you sit down and do in a day or in an hour. It typically takes days, weeks, sometimes months to complete. And there has to be something that you produce at the end. So it might be a paper would be a good example of a project. So it's not part of your routine everyday stuff. It's a special thing that has an endpoint. So with that in mind, I'll start with, I have two client stories to share that I think illustrate the issues around organizing projects. So this client was someone at the University of Iowa in a clinical department who was kind of probably about 4 years into the mission as an associate professor. So she'd already made the first promotion. She did educational research and was a cert in a surgical subspecialty. So she was super busy. And called me one day because she said, she'd been to a couple of my workshops and said, I just am feeling so overwhelmed right now. I have so many things to do, and I'm hoping to go up for promotion in the next year or two, and I need to somehow get myself on track. So I said, okay. And I went to her office. This was kind of in my pre-Zoom, pre-pandemic days, and met with her. And so we sat across her desk. This is metaphorically her desk. And I said, well, let's take a look at your project list. And she looked at me and she looked down at that middle drawer, that some, and pulled it open and pulled out an empty legal pad, and put it on the table. And I said, you don't have a project list. Is that correct? She said, I do not. And so so what she had instead was all these things that she thought she knew she had to do floating around in her head. So we spent the rest of this hour making a list of those things. And then once we did that, we were able to put them in priority order in terms of when she should be working on them. And she took that list and then got back on track. She wasn't stressed about remembering things. Now she could just work on working through each of these things that she had recorded. So the first commandment of project work is to keep a list. In fact, this would be one of the maybe one or two things or three things that I hope you'll come out of this session doing today. I hope you start your list today. In fact, if you want to just ignore me while I'm talking for the next few minutes, go ahead and start your list right now. This is really, really, really important. So the first question is, what are your current projects? So we need to talk a little bit more about what those are. So the obvious academic projects you can think of, maybe you're writing a paper, maybe you're writing a grant, maybe you're writing a chapter, maybe you're writing something that's going to be for publication. Or you have a new talk to give, either to students or to the department or at a national meeting. You have a talk to present and something new, so you've got to get that done. If you're doing any kind of educational work, maybe you have to design a new curriculum for a clerkship. Maybe you have to develop a new section of a curriculum around a particular topic for your medical students or residents, whatever it is. So those are obvious projects. Does everybody see, by the way, why they're projects? There's a concrete outcome at the end. You have the curriculum plan in your hand. You've given the talk. Okay, so that's pretty obvious. So we're good so far. Now, I want you to expand your idea of projects to extend beyond these obvious academic ones, because people often think about it that way. And then they have all this other project work that never gets recorded or planned. And now we're back in that same muddle of being overwhelmed by all the things we have to do. So some other things that might count would be if you have an event that you have to plan. So planning for this session today was a project at your end by the people who plan, and at my end for the preparation. We both had projects, and we're getting to cross them off after this session. Maybe you're helping to hire somebody for a research group or for the educational group, or you're in charge of a committee to hire a new faculty member. Maybe you have a conflict between residents that you are having to solve. That's a project too, because it's work over and above multiple tasks over time, and the outcome hopefully will be a resolution of the conflict. Maybe you're getting ready for board recertification. Maybe you're getting ready for promotion. Those are projects as well, the preparation for that event. So I think you can see that it's a bigger deal. And you can also apply this, and I'd encourage you to do it, to things you're doing outside of work. You have a big birthday party to plan. You have to get your kids situated in camp for this summer. Those are projects. Clear outcome, lots of tasks, then you're done. So I want to make one other distinction, which is I realize this, I often fail to make, and it can cause confusion here. So a project and a goal or a responsibility are different things. So think of the hats that you wear. So here are some examples. So let's say you have teaching responsibilities. So that's a role, but that's not a project because it's ongoing. There's no product. But maybe you need to create a new lecture. That's a project that emerges out of your teaching role. And Maybe you are the principal investigator of a grant that is already funded. That's not a project. The project now, running the grant is kind of part of your everyday work. And so the projects are the discrete deliverables that you need to develop out of that grant. So writing a paper, if it's a clinical trial, maybe your project is finalizing recruitment of subjects. That's the project, and then you're done. If you're a parent, it feels like a project, doesn't it? But actually, there are things that you do within that. So summer camps would be a project. If you're a residency director, this is where the conflict comes up. Getting fit is not a project because there's no clear deliverable as that's written. So instead, training, now see, I'd be walking, not running, but you might want to run. Training for a 5K walk, that would be a project. Prep, thing, buy new shoes, blah, 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 do the walk, you're done. So I hope that helps distinguish between roles, which are important, and are where projects often emerge, but the projects themselves represent the work that you need to do over and above. Okay, now the second client is someone who did have a project list, and he made his list on Post-it notes. So now I never actually saw this, but I was described to me by him, and so he had one Post-it note per project and had these displayed somehow around on the wall or around his computer so he could see them when he, sat down at his desk. And so here was his experience. He had made his project list, excellent. But here's what happened. He'd come in the morning, intent on doing project work, and he'd look up at those Post-it notes, and then he'd look down on his desk where he had a sheet of paper where he had little tasks that needed to be done. Now, which do you think he chose? Grant or email X about Y? He always went for the little piece of paper with the little tasks. Because when you put a big project outcome versus a task that you can actually do, in pretty readily, your brain is always going to go for the little thing every time. There are 2 or 3 cognitive biases that drive us in that direction. So the second part, excuse me, we have the pollen is like at an all-time high here. I'm not ill, I just have allergies, excuse me. So the second part of project work is to have some kind of a plan so that you always know at any time what you're going to do next for that project. That's the basic idea. So instead of saying grant, you're going to say edit the first paragraph of the discussion to get you started. So you're always going to have the little thing, the next thing that you're going to do. Okay, so I'm going to give you just an outline for a really simple project plan. You won't even need to do this much for most of your projects, but for some it will be very helpful. So the first thing is to describe in as much detail as you think you need to what your outcome actually is, and then ask yourself, well, what do I need to do? What do I need to do to get here? And just brainstorm a list of the things. That's pretty. I'm going to show you an example in a minute. And then the third part, which is almost never done, but has again a research basis for recommending this, is to ask yourself, now that you've looked at kind of your plan, what are the potential obstacles you might face, either internally because of the way you do work, and externally. And then if you there's always an obstacle. Whatever you can think of, think about what would you do to either prevent that, or if it happens, what would be a way to get started. And then the final thing is always to ask, what is the very next task? Or if it's something that you want to spend some time on initially, what would you do with the time block that you could put on your calendar? So more than a task, but like, I'm going to spend an hour doing more planning, or whatever it is. So that's the idea. So let me give you an example of this. So, and of course my control panel up here blocks the whole thing. Okay. So here's our project. We're going to plan the July 15th Resident Research Day. The first thing to do is to define the outcome, which for some reason, there we go. So here's my outcome description. So the program will include a 45-minute keynote address by an outside speaker, a 20-minute presentation per resident project. The presentation will be judged. Each resident will get written or oral feedback. We'll have lunch and maybe a late afternoon reception. There we go. So that's, do you see how there's enough detail in there to kind of get a picture? If you have a kind of a picture of what the day might look like. Now, the reason that you want to do that in part is because it concretizes the outcome. So you know when you're finished. But in addition to that, a well-done outcome statement drives the things that you have to do. I mean, if you look at this, you could make a list right now for this. You have got to find a keynote speaker, apparently. And we don't know, we have a day already, but do we have a room? We got to obviously have to have a room big enough for everybody. We need judges and we need food. So from this outcome statement, it drives you toward things that you need to do. So here's just a quick list that I put together. Find out about the budget, get a room, save the date to the department, find a speaker, send reminders to residents eventually about presentation guidelines, plan the food, get faculty to cover the clinics for the day or for emergency halls. I always had to do that. You might have to pay a lot of money for that part. I don't know, you'll have to see. And then get some people to serve as judges. There are probably more things, but here I'm just trying to identify the things I can think of, kind of the big pieces that have to happen. Okay, so now I have a row, and I'd probably put those in whatever the right order is. And now I'm going to ask myself about obstacles. What if I can't do all of that on the budget I have? Rooms are hard to get that time of year, probably not, but we'll pretend that they are. I don't know what we want for a keynote speaker. I realize I have no idea, and I have never done this before. So the plan I made was I'm going to be prepared to reduce the food plan or find more money. I'm going to get on this right away. I'm going to ask the residents for topics and then get faculty input as to speaker names. And then I'm going to get on the schedule of the person who did it last year and go over this whole thing. So now I've thought about what my concerns are, and I've got a little plan, and other things will come up, but this will get you to thinking. And it'll also, as you can see, drive the order in which you do things, because you realize that there are things that you have to get going on right away. And then we're at our final step, which is what's the next task? Now, you'll notice here that I've written, this is a really detailed task. Send an Outlook meeting invite to the departmental administrator to discuss the budget and room arrangements. So my personal experience has been, as a procrastinator, lifelong pervasive procrastinator, is that writing out the task, the thing I'm actually going to do next, in as much detail as necessary, so that when I come to looking at that on my list, I don't have to do anything to think about it. I can just do it, has been one of the most helpful techniques I have ever used. Now, these things that we've written up above, what do I need, are not at a task level using this definition. Those are just little mini outcomes I need to achieve. So the first thing I'm going to do is deal with budget and room, because those are kind of critical. And once I've done this, what do you suppose I do? I make another thing. So you finish one and then you make another. Anybody have any questions about this? What do you think?
Susan, where do you keep this? Like, do you print it? Do you have it visible on your desk? Or
yeah, that's a really good question. The full answer is sort of beyond the scope of our time today.
Okay.
I would say that for me, I have I happen to use a digital app where I have a sort of a note for every project, and in that note is the detail. You can do this in a binder where you have a page for each project and you put the plan there. And lots of to-do apps allow you to make a list of projects with a note section. So you do have to find some place to write this down. Now, you might be thinking that for all of your projects, this seems like way too much. And sometimes you don't need all of this, but the two things you absolutely need, that in my opinion, are necessary for me to execute any project, no matter how big or small, is to define my outcome and decide on the next thing to do. Define my outcome and the very next thing to do. Sometimes I don't need to do the part in the middle because I've sort of done it before, or it's not that big, but those other two parts are really critical for me to get through. Oh, there, I even outlined them in red, so that was smart. Somebody else had a question?
Yes, my question is, whenever I work on putting my action items together for the projects that I have, I find myself utilizing more time than I should be allotting to do this. And I think that's one of my biggest struggles, to figure out how much time do I need to spend on this and how often should I be going back to preparing a list like this.
So can you hold that thought, because we're going to talk about that in the next section. In fact, probably in just about a minute and a half. Anything else? Okay. So what you're going to end up with if you use this approach is two kinds of lists. One is a place where you can look at all of the projects you're currently working on. And then you need to have a place to keep track of tasks. Now, the reason that so what I'm showing you here is not an actual system for organizing them. I'm showing you conceptually that your projects are a list of these outcomes you're trying to achieve. And your task list needs to have all of your tasks on it. So every project will have a task that you want to work on in the coming week or so. There has to be a task here. We're going to do that. And for this one, we're going to draft objectives. But you also have all the other things in your life that are tasks, that are what we might call standalone tasks. They're not part of projects. They're just tasks. So I like a system personally for keeping track where you can have projects and then a separate task list, or where they can, separate task list. And ideally you would use an app where, if you're inclined to do this, where you can have them both together and don't have to rewrite the tasks. Now, what I just said may not make a whole lot of sense. How many people here use Outlook? And how many people here pretty sure they're on Outlook 365? Which is kind of the newest version of Outlook. So there's Microsoft has a new, basically to-do list app called Microsoft To Do, which will accomplish exactly what I just talked about. It will allow you to make, in the app, you can create projects. Each project has a list associated with it, so you can put the tasks in there. And then you can just put plain old standalone tasks in a separate location. And then you can see all those tasks at one time. I'm just going to say this and not say anymore. If to each task you're ready to put on your task list, you assign a due date. And then you can look at all of those tasks in a part of a folder called Planner, which is just a list of tasks in the order of the due dates. And the key to this whole system is that you're going to use the word due, not as D-U-E, no, as D-O, the day I want to do that task. And this allows you to say, what task should I do this week? And you assign the date for, dates in the current week. And then to reorganize your list, you just change the date to a later date or an earlier date. So that was a very quick explanation of a really nice way to do this. That's already will be part of Outlook. If you don't have it already, you can, if you don't, so here's my offer. I'm willing to have an hour free coaching session with everybody who watches this video who's part of the program. Not random people who watch the program that you show, just the people who are here. And that might be one of the things you might want me to show you. It doesn't take long to demo that. And then there may be some other things that you'd like help with too. So make a note of that. And I'll send a scheduling link out. Sandy, I'll send you that link. Okay, so now let's talk about planning. Here's the reason why we plan. Now I have to tell you, what do you think? I describe it in audiences like you. I talk to my clients about planning, and I'll be describing what they should do. And halfway through it, I've had 2 people in the last 2 months stop me and say, how long is this going to take? One fellow, quite in that tone of voice, how long is this going to take? I'm already too busy. And I get that. This sounds like, how could I spend even 1 more minute planning when I have so much work to do? So here I'm gonna build my argument. So here's the time situation that you face looking at any given period of time. But let's think about the week. You have more things on your lists than you can possibly do in 1 week. It's not possible. I mean, it's literally impossible, and you know that. So you have a big list of things and only this much time. So what are you going to do with that? Well, what a lot of people do is they just launch into the week and then randomly pick things as it moves them as the day goes on, and then they get inundated with things that are new, and they set anything they might be thinking about aside to do the new stuff. And at the end of the week, they say, I just didn't get anything done. And it's true. It's true. You didn't get as much done of the important stuff that you want to do. And so the purpose of doing a weekly and also daily plan is to try to select the most important work or the best work to do this week, given the amount of time that you have. Will this ever be perfect? No. But are you going to have a better chance at actually getting the right things done? Yes. You'll definitely have a better chance of getting more of the right things done if you spend some time planning. And so this is Laura Vanderkam, who is a wonderful journalist, now time management book writer. And in one of her books, she says just what you can read her quote there. And the last line is the important one. If something has to give, you want it to make sure it's the right thing. Okay, that's my little speech, my sermon. So let's talk about, I'm going to walk through now a method for doing a weekly review. And this is, I would think that this weekly review and planning process for you you should be able to do it pretty much in a half an hour. If you wanted to spend more time because you have more things you want to plan, then that'll be fine. But you should be able to do this in about a half an hour. So the prequel to this, if you will, which is optional, but I would encourage you to think about doing it, is to look at the grid of your week on your calendar and think about, how would I like to spend my time this week overall? So, including the weekends. What would be the best Monday through Sunday? Well, how would I like to spend my time? And do a little thinking around that. And I'm just, again, sort of showing you conceptually, draw some boxes around the time that you want to spend working, with the idea that you won't be working outside of those boxes. Now, this can change, I understand. And I'm not in any way implying that you're done by 6 o'clock every day, or that you don't start till 8, or that you would only work outside of those hours once a week. I'm not. I'm just saying this is the idea. And maybe you'll have red boxes on Saturday and Sunday morning and another night that week. But the idea of the box is to create some boundaries, so that you don't let yourself just pervasive your work, feel like you're working all the time. And because it's okay to work outside of your regular work hours. In academics, you have to do that, but just make a plan around it. And then plan some time, what you'll do on your time off. So instead of just letting the weekend come and go, and like me, ending up going to the grocery store, cleaning the kitchen, and then it's time for a Netflix binge for the next 10 hours. Have some things that you would like to do by yourself, with your family, with friends, and pencil them in. Make a few plans with people, because if you don't do that, the time just whiles away, and you don't get the rest and rejuvenation and so forth that you need. Okay, let's talk about, now we're going to focus now on work, the work review. You can expand this very idea and include home stuff as well, but I'm just going to talk about Monday through Friday, or whatever your work hours are. So this is really a basic review. We're going to walk through step by step. Here we go. So get a piece of paper. Now, what I'm talking about, you can do this however you want, but if you don't have a method, get a piece of paper like this, and at the top of it, write review and plan for the week of whatever the week is. Gather together your inventory of work. This is all the places where the work that you have in front of you is recorded. And so one of those places is on your calendar. So pull up your calendar in a week view. And here you can see those white things are scheduled events. Now, this is my calendar. I'm retired. So actually, I made this calendar up because I think I have clinic on here. So if I just tried to make something, yours will look a lot busier some weeks, less busy other weeks. So that's one thing you need to have for this review. The second thing is you have to have your project list. And I'm just going to assume you're going to have one, or at least a beginning one. And then you need to collect all the places your tasks are recorded, wherever they may be. Now, if you have to do this enough time, you'll realize maybe it would be nice to have one place where all my tasks are recorded. Excellent idea. But for now, maybe you have a notebook here, a notebook there, a folder there, an online thing, a stack of Post-it notes, a little spiral notebook you carry around in your pocket. Get them all together because you're going to look at all that stuff. So we're going to look through all of this and come up with a choice for what we're going to work on this week. That's the idea. So first we'll start with the calendar review. So we have our calendar and our piece of paper. We look at each item that's scheduled, every single one, and say, is there anything I need to prepare for in advance for this thing? So if you're somebody that normally looks at certain elements of like the clinic list before you go to clinic, or look at charts, records, then make a note about that if you haven't done it yet. So we're going to look through each item, and on Wednesday morning, we have a committee meeting online and we don't have the Zoom link. It appears we don't have a Zoom link. So we have to do that. And there's an agenda that I haven't looked at yet. So on my calendar notes, I'm going to write down, get the Zoom link for the Wednesday meeting and review the agenda. So I'll make a note of everything I come up with as I go through. One year I did this, I was doing this and I found a meeting at the beginning of the following week that had no plane tickets, just as an example. Or a talk I gave last week, I had no idea where the room was in the hospital. So I had to make a note to look at the map of the hospital and come up so that I could pick the right place to park and so forth. So some of the things you're going to do here are going to be logistical, but some of them are going to be more substantive. So maybe your annual review is coming up on Friday and you haven't filled out the form yet. So that will be your deal to do that. And then once you've done this week in some detail, then I want you to scan ahead for the next 2, 3, or 4 weeks. And there you're just looking for big events that maybe you need to be, deadlines, big things, meetings you're going to, trips, whatever, that maybe you need to do start preparing for now, and then just make notes about those. So the outward look, it can be as much as you want. Any questions about that part? This next part is look at your project list. I recommend looking at this before. The order here I've given you is intentional. For me, this turns out to be the best order, partly because if I do the calendar review and I get interrupted and can't go back to any more review, I've gained a lot just by going into the week knowing what's coming up and then I'm ready for it. And then the project list, it's better to do that first so that when you're revising the task list, you're not going around in circles. Instead, you go here. And so you've got your project list. It'll be a lot longer than this one. This is just a sample. So the first thing you want to do is to pick out the projects that you want to do some work on this week. This needs to be a small number for any of the bigger projects. And so I recommend that you start by thinking about one that you want to put a primary focus on, and maybe 2 or 3 others where there may be just a task or 2 to do. So don't try to overload, be limited. And so we're going to work on that paper this week. That's going to be our primary. And we've got some tasks we are going to do on those 2. So that's our project focus for the week. And then as you can imagine, what we're going to do is on our project notes section, we're going to write down exactly what we're going to do about that project this week. So for the paper, I'm going to find an hour when I can start working on the discussion. And then for the research assistant, we're kind of at the beginning of this. And so I need a copy of a draft job description that I can edit. And then for the research day, it's time to send an email out to the residents to ask them about topics they may want to hear about for the keynote. So now I've got a plan for my projects. It may be more than this, but again, this is just so you get the process. And now we're going to look at all those tasks, hopefully in one nice list, but if not, the big mess. And here, we're not necessarily going to put things on this list, the paper. You have options about how to handle your choice, your prioritization of the tasks. So the first thing you want to do, if you have just a single list, this is easy. You just find some way to mark the ones that really look like you should do them this week. So here, this one, those 3 are the ones I should really get to this week. And there may be more than that. 3 is not a magic number here. In fact, in theory, you could go up to as many as like 15 or so things that really you'd like to finish by the end of the week, because you're going to divide those up into different days. So it's not like you're trying to do. So if you have multiple locations for your tasks, as I mentioned, here, there, and everywhere, then what you should do is write them on this piece of paper so that you don't, that'll be the best way to do it. So you can record them, highlight them on this. If you have that that Microsoft to-do list, you just change the due date and pop it up into the current week. And then every day you're going to this task list, the calendar review and the project notes you're done with at the beginning of the week. You don't have to go back there. But the tasks you're going to review every day, you're gonna not look at every task, but you're going to look at your tasks for the next day and make a decision about what's most important, because new stuff will come up that's urgent and so on. So the task list is kind of a daily review thing. Did that make sense? Okay. Now, as you think about when you're going to do this important, especially the project work in this current week, a principle that's important that was helpful is to think about front loading that work. So front loading simply means that you plan, your intent is to do work related to those projects early in the week, and if it's in any given day, early in the day. So starting early rather than putting off. So one client that I worked with, we were meeting on a Monday morning, and she said that she had this important thing that was due the following Monday. And I said, well, maybe we should do a time block. And she said, good idea, because we had talked about that. And she immediately went to late Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock. And I said, no, don't you have some time today that you could get started? And in fact, there was a whole hour available for after our call. So she did that. So she worked on Monday and Tuesday. And by Wednesday, she had it pretty much done, so that she had a lot of flexibility in the rest of the week for finalizing things, and was able to take on some emergency teaching duties because somebody was sick, and got her project done in time. Now, that's a beautiful story that's true, and it won't always work out that way. But the more you can start early so that you have more flexibility down the road, the better. Okay, so now the daily plan, there's a lot of things you can do. I'm just going to tell you about one of them, which I think for most people getting started with this is the most important one. And that is before you go to work, preferably the day before, the night before, so anytime after work before the following morning, make a list of the top 3 tasks, that you would like to do tomorrow. Does that mean you'll only do 3 things? No, these are the tasks that usually are going to be related to high priority work, project work that wouldn't otherwise get done in a normal day. And you want to focus on those. There are 2 categories that I consider. Is there some task of any kind that is due today? There's an actual due date, no matter how important it is, because if there's a consequence of not doing it on time, I have to add that to the list. And then I pick no more than 3 for the rest. So the reason this works is, and there's lots of experiential evidence for the last 100 years or more, that if people have a long list for the day, they never finish it. And then if most people are like me, you pick the easy things to pick off so you can do lots of checks and cross outs. But if you have a tiny list, you're more likely to get it done. And if those tiny amount of things are important, you're still more likely to get them done. So it gets you to really focus in on the important stuff. Okay, so that's the most important task list. That's what MIT stands for. So now let's finish up by talking about finding time to do all this stuff, because you're thinking, well, that front loading slide was really cool, but I have never had an open Monday to schedule 8 time blocks in my life. Do you remember that slide? You thought, ha, 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 this one? You don't have days like that. I understand. Okay, so let's talk about this. So one of the pervasive myths among academics, especially with respect to writing, is that you can't do any real writing unless you have a big block of uninterrupted time. I don't know if any of you have ever had that thought. Let's all nod if it's true. So you may know that, well, you probably know, because I bet you've attended, you've talked about writing before, that there's plenty of evidence that you can do effective writing in much smaller amounts of time if you do it regularly. So it's the so-called moderate periods of writing nearly every day approach, which has been now is the prevailing way to talk about doing academic writing. It turns out that, on the other hand, there is that approach definitely can work. I'd encourage you to try it and to make that part of your practice to the extent that you can. But it turns out that successful writers have a wide variety of writing practices. That what distinguishes all of them, though, is that they are, when they're working on a writing project, they are continuously engaged with it. They don't work on it and then set it aside for 4 weeks and then come back and try to pick it back up again. That doesn't work for anybody. So your job is to come up with a method that works for you. And this framework has been helpful for me in thinking that through. Oh, well, at first I have to give you Cal Newport's advice. How many of you have heard, do you know Cal Newport, the book Deep Work? So Cal Newport is an important person in this discussion because he's a tenured professor of computer science, theoretical computer science at Georgetown. And he is extremely prolific scholar and has been writing on the other, has a side business writing books about time management and organization, and now a whole variety of things related to the world of work on the side. So he started in graduate school writing time management books for high school students, and then he started turning to adult work when he was a postdoc. And Deep Work is his work from a few years ago that a lot of academics know, because the whole book is about the importance of having time that's uninterrupted where you can concentrate on work that requires deep thinking, which is most writing projects or data analysis projects time. And his book is called Deep Work. And so that's a book about time blocking, basically, and all the different ways that you can implement it. So what Cal says here, I think, is really important, which is that you can't just wait until you have time. You have to actively fight to incorporate this work into your schedule. And so that's what we're going to talk about right now. So for me, I think that the key strategy is to be prepared to work on the projects you've selected for the week, no matter how much time you end up having. So maybe it looked like you were going to have time and then it got cut and it came up at odd times. Let's be prepared to do some work no matter what. And so here are the timeframes that I think are useful to think about. One is the big time block, the long amount of time, which doesn't come up very often, but can be quite useful. And so if you need that, you need to take advantage of it and probably schedule them. There's the moderate time block that we talked about, which is in the 30 to 60 minute range. And many days you could probably do something in that range if you plan for it. And then there are also things you can do for any project, including every single writing project, that you can do quickly in the 10-minute or less range. And so the idea here is when you're planning those 2 or 3 projects you're going to work on, try to come up with things that fit into the moderate and brief session. So maybe you'll have a short time block goal and well as 1 or 2 tasks. And then if you have prepared in advance, maybe you've already reserved a longer time block for that week that you'll plan for. So thinking about it in that way allows you, even on a day when your longed for 2 hours falls apart because of a patient in the emergency room, you have some tasks that you can do for that project that day. And so here's the sort of an underlying idea. Every time you think about or work actively, you productively think about, not ruminate in grief over how you're not working on something, but real productive work. Every time you think about a project, come up with a new idea, do a little bit of anything, it keeps that project, as one writer called it, alive in your mind. Your subconscious stays focused on it. More new ideas come up. When you finally come to a time when you do have some time to work, you're going to be way more productive. So it's this kind of constant reinforcement that you're working on this project that is the key. Okay, so let's talk about time blocking a little bit. Has anybody here used time blocking? And so quickly, what kind of troubles have you had with it? There are many. I mean, I personally think that for clinicians, this is really hard to do in any big way. So,
Well, you get,
Sidetracked.
yes, like you start checking labs and then making phone calls to patients in the morning and that they take longer or walking down the hallway, takes longer.
so Susie, this is a very interesting sentence that you said. I get sidetracked. What you mean is I let myself get sidetracked.
Yes.
And that's an important distinction because that's different than I get emergency patient calls. There's
Right.
So there are some things that come up that interrupt you that you have to deal with.
Mhm.
But there are the things that you choose to do different instead. You can work on not, letting yourself. I mean, this is not simple. I'm not saying that, but just recognize when it's you that's causing the sidetracking, and when other people interrupt you, think about. If someone says, "I need to talk to you," ask them if this could wait for half an hour. Or would it be okay to get back to them later today? Say, because I'm in the middle of doing some writing, or just, say I'm in the middle of doing some work that requires focus. And so if I could talk to you later, that would be great. So you can also renegotiate with other people more often than you think you could. Because remember, this work that you are trying to do is maybe not the most important part of your job, but it's a darn important part. And so if you're going to be effective in your job, you have to do this project work. And to simply let other people just willy-nilly and let yourself willy-nilly distract you from it is, well, that's not a good idea. So it's just a matter of trying to focus on how are you going to change that, really. I know you know that already.
I think the other thing
Yeah.
that, again, it's accountability for the time blocking and valuing it, but for others to realize the value of time blocking. So like, as a faculty, like if my program director or someone above me thinks that the task that they have for me is more important than what I have for myself. So my value and others valuing my time blocking. I think that's the struggle that I also deal with.
Yeah. And I think I've talked about sort of certain others, people that aren't your bosses up the chain. But when you have people up the chain, there are lots of different approaches that simultaneously. One is if the work you're doing is valued by the department. Now, maybe it isn't, but if it is, it might be worth having a conversation, with your chair, or to say, I wonder if all of us have to get this kind of stuff done. And we live in a culture of constant interruptions, and some of that's inevitable. But I wonder if we could have a conversation among us about how there are certain times when we're doing this kind of academic work, we need to stay focused. And could we have a way to let other people know that we're doing that and have some common agreement? Now that may or may not work. Depends on who the chair is and who your colleagues are. You can also just approach it one-on-one and say, I'm in the middle of finishing the discussion of a paper. I'll be done with this session, my session, in about a half an hour. Can it wait till then? So if you say what you're doing that you think is of value, and they say, no, you have to drop that and do it anyway, then you have to drop it and do it anyway. But don't just give up. And sometimes it'll be obvious that the request is one that needs to be done. So you have to use judgment about this. But if you can start to put out the idea that you are doing work that's not just, and it is important to you and your career for sure, but it's also important to the department that this stuff happens. So it's not that you're being selfish here. You're doing something that benefits you and others and the world, who is going to, the residents who are going to be the recipients of this great curriculum thing, or patients, or the public for some paper that you're writing. So the downstream effects of what you're doing, that's why you came to academics. So that sounded pretty grand, didn't it? But that's really the idea. But you have to believe that. And if you believe it, you can start to work on figuring out ways to do it. Okay. So this is just maybe partly a reiteration of what I've said before, is when you make a plan to do some work this week, make it specific. So that when you sit down at a time block, you're not just saying, oh, Grant, you're saying, pull up the paper and start at the first paragraph of the discussion and start editing, or go to the method section and start writing, or go to the figure and start drawing, whatever it is, have a very specific thing, stay focused. By intentionally saying to yourself, I'm going to try to avoid letting myself get interrupted. I'm not going to interrupt myself. And when other people do, I'm going to make a decision about whether to stop or not. I'm just not going to fall into it. And then the final thing to do when you finish doing anything, a time block or a task, actually, on a project, either one, ask yourself, what's the next thing? So is there another time block I should schedule? And if so, what am I going to do with that? Is there a task that comes next? I finish this task. What's the next task? Always figure out immediately what the next thing is, because then you're prepared to work instead of think when the time comes. So you always want to have a plan ready to go. The Pomodoro technique is a focusing technique. How many have you heard of do you know the Pomodoro method? Yeah, and so this question about that you ask when you get interrupted with a Pomodoro of can this wait till the timer goes off is basically what I was talking about. Can this thing I'm being interrupted about, can it wait until I'm finished with this segment? And if it is, then you should try to get out of it. So we've talked about that. All right, so time block scheduling. These are some options that you have. One is to pick the same time every day. I'm going to guess none of you can do that. The advantage of this technique is that it helps establish a habit. If you're a chemistry professor, you can do this. I have a client who's a chemistry professor. He does this. He and all his graduate students every day sit for an hour and work at the beginning of the day, but you can't do that. So if you can, that's great. The only way you could do this is if you did it before you got to work, and that probably isn't a realistic option. Another approach, which is the one that I think most clinicians use if they're going to time block, is an ad hoc approach, where at the beginning of the week or for a couple of weeks, you'll find open spots and dump some time blocks in. And then you'll decide what to do with them during your weekly plan for that week. So that's one option. The ad hoc is probably more realistic. And then some people have a so-called admin day or a day for scholarship. Do any of you have that in your project where in theory on Fridays you don't have everything scheduled? Or yeah, so this can be useful, but not as useful, of course, as you want it to be, because the way you can make this more useful is to block out the first 2 hours to do nothing but your academic work. No email, no phone calls, no nothing. Do 2 hours and then see what happens. Because I know you have other things you have to do during that time, but if you put your important work first, it's less likely to, you're more likely to get something done. If you do the other work first, it will just expand to fill the entire day. So that's a front loading thing. And there's one other approach, which actually is quite valuable. It's the unscheduled method. So Neil Fiore was a psychologist who wrote his first book, which was about overcoming procrastination, based on his experience working with graduate students who couldn't get their dissertations run and written. And so in his approach, what he did, he stopped asking them to plan when they were going to write. He said, instead, do the rest of your day, do some fun things, make sure you get enough rest and relaxation in there. And then if you happen to write it on your calendar. So the idea was if they felt like writing, they did it and recorded it. They didn't plan it. So this method is a variation of that, where you go into the week with an intention to work on this project and you have things prepared to do when the time comes. And then when a moment comes up and you decide it's time, you just do it. It's in the moment decision kind of thing. And sometimes you can actually even do some real writing in that moment of 5 or 10 minutes, where an idea will come to you whole and you just quickly write it down. So this is just do something and record it. You don't have to put it on your calendar. Maybe you'll keep a list, in your notes or something for the day about having done this. But this can be quite effective. There's one case report of a clinician who used this approach and increased his writing productivity like twofold, just by taking advantage of in the moment thinking. So a combination, you can put these together in any which way that you want. Okay, now we're finished now with the content. So these are some books that you might want to look at. The book about academic writing that you may know about already is the one on the left, Paul Sylvia's book, How to Write a Lot. Are you familiar with that? So Paul is an academic clinical psychologist, and his first edition of the book I thought was impractical for my crowd, because he said you have to schedule 8 to 10 every morning and write in moment, and don't ever let yourself be interrupted. And so I kind of put it in the trash. But then he came out with a second edition, and I thought, well, I better take a look at it. And what happened was he had children in between the two editions. And this book is wonderful now. He gets it. And so there's just a million different ways to work writing in and all the overcoming. The other book on the other side by Jolie Jensen is written from a kind of in a liberal arts voice, because she's a communication studies, but it's the same message, but they kind of cover some different topics around this idea of regular writing. So I think they're nice complements. Deep work we've talked about if you want to read more about time blocking. And The Now Habit is the Neil Fiore book where that strategy of unscheduling is written. So in addition, on my website, there are a series of articles that I wrote. They're all, except for the email one, they're 1,800 words long. So they're good introductions to some things we didn't talk about today. There's a longer piece on email management. There's a short piece on writing that kind of covers some of the same ground, but some more information, and a piece on interruptions. The others might be helpful too. There's one on time blocking. So lots of ideas for you there. If you want kind of a more comprehensive system of planning your work, David Allen's, did anybody know this book? So the core ideas around planning and so forth come from him. And then this is the Laura Vanderkam. So here's the book that she wrote based on the study of time records kept by 100 women, or 143 women who had professional, full-time professional work and at least one child at home. She has 5 children now, by the way. And so she, in this book, she studied the time diaries and came up with a series of 8 different strategies that these women used to be able to integrate home and work and sort of get everything that they wanted to do in their lives. You'll email me, you'll get a link to schedule an hour with me, which is good for a year, so don't put it off. Any quick questions? I know we're a little bit at the time, but
if you were going to suggest one book from all of those to get started, what one would you suggest?
you know, that's a good question. I think it depends on what your issue is. If your really focused issue is around writing, then I'd get the Paul Sylvia book and start with that. If you want a system for keeping project and organizing projects and tasks and not letting a bunch of all your stuff kind of float around in limbo and get it all into one organized system, then the GTD book. Now that book can by itself be overwhelming to people who are feeling overwhelmed. So my only hesitation is that you have to, if you read through chapter 2 of that book, which is the basic workflow process, and just follow that and see if that appeals to you, then I'd go with that book too. That book was, they say life-changing. That book was life-changing for me, but it isn't for everybody. I understand that. The other option that you have, instead of going with a book, is picking something out of the things we talked about today and start doing those. I think I've given you enough instructions that you can at least get started. And sometimes that'll be the best way, because then you start to get a handle on whether something works or not and how to keep track of it. And then,
I already have.
all right, good.
Helpful.
Yeah. And it is important not to try to do all of these things at one time. So when I work with clients, I realize I think what the most effective thing is I say, well, what's the thing that's bothering you the most right now? And then work on that. Even if everything's a mess, what's the one you really, the biggest pain point, basically? And let's start doing that. And then once you start to feel better about that thing, you're ready to move on if you need to. Anything else? All right, well, it was great to talk to you today. Look forward to talking to you again, I hope.